Welcome to Philosophy of Value Workshops number 6 of series 8. The question for today is, what can existentialism tell us about human existence as consciousness? Reading from one of my works, The Pursuit of Value, chapter 1, section 9. Last week we examined phenomenology as an alternative to psychology as a way of understanding consciousness. Yet we saw that phenomenology also provides a theoretical base for existentialism. But phenomenology is not the same as existentialism. Existentialism is primarily concerned with human actions, situations and experiences. It delves into the nitty-gritty of human life. So today we will discuss existentialism as an approach to human life and philosophy. Existentialism is relevant to my own philosophical project for several reasons. One, it is an applied or practical philosophy about human existence. Two, it employs a theory of consciousness that's related to phenomenology as well as my own account. And three, it has significant things to say about the key concept of value. Existentialism has often been thought difficult to define. It has been asked whether it's a philosophy or an attitude. But there are a number of reasons for this, perhaps unjustified view of existentialism. It has an unfamiliar, amorphous and diverse subject matter. It also contrasts with familiar rationalist approaches like analytic philosophy. But existentialism can be understood by both its subject matter and its method. The subject matter of existentialism covers difficult aspects of human experience, such as anxiety, death, care, despair, possibility, alienation, absurdity, mood and dread. Yet existentialism isn't philosophical anarchy because it holds certain tenets or principles. Its main principles are freedom, authenticity and responsibility. Yet it also espouses others like choice, commitment and individuality. This is another reason why existentialism is thought difficult to define. That is, the diversity of its adherents. Of course, Husserl wasn't an existentialism, but he founded phenomenology on which existentialism rests. Martin Heidegger denied that he was an existentialist, but everybody accepts him as one. But this is typical of existentialists who say, I am myself, I'm not classifiable as anything. Also, existentialists are anti-establishment, and most are atheists. But some existentialists are believers. These include Søren Kierkegaard, Gabriel Marcel, Paul Tillich, Rudolf Bultmann and Dostoevsky. It's interesting to note that there don't seem to be any Islamic existentialists. Other well-known existentialists in chronological order include Nietzsche, Jean-Paul Sartre, Simone de Beauvoir, Albert Camus and Hannah Arendt. The philosophical methods of existentialism were developed from that of phenomenological description. Last week we saw Simone de Beauvoir's description of Sartre's discovery of phenomenology. That is, phenomenology as a practical method to apply philosophy to real life situations. And his work is full of phenomenological descriptions of existential events. for example, the inauthentic waiter, the peeping Tom who perceives himself, and the fixated judge. These examples illustrate how existentialism doesn't demonstrate its principles by the standard methods of proof. And as another example, the existence of the world is presupposed rather than having to be proven. Consciousness is described in accounts of our situations in the world. Other people are demonstrated in states like guilt and shame before the other. Free will is revealed to us in our anxiety. These are phenomenological intuitions rather than formal proofs. The existentialist preference for description is not only motivated by phenomenological method, it's also motivated by the view that communication is always far from perfect, if not impossible. This view builds on the fact that there is always a linguistic gap between description and reality. And Wittgenstein, although not an existentialist, warns of the bewitchment of language. And Heidegger regards all language as metaphor. Before discussing some existentialist themes in detail, we can note some criticisms of the existentialist approach. Professor Macquarie, translator of Being and Time, and Oxford Bishop, gives 5 criticisms of existentialism. It is, he says, 1. Irrationalist, 2. Amoralist, 3. Individualist, 4. Pessimistic, and 5. Narrowly humanistic. Yet these features can also be seen as advantages as well as weaknesses. Rationality is subject to modern criticism, and human life may not be amenable to strict logic and reason. Amoralism is also a feature of modern life where moralistic judgments are thought to be immoral. Similar things could also be said about existentialist individualism and pessimism. The charge of being narrowly humanistic is both praise and criticism of a developing method. It is certainly broader and more humanistic than analytic philosophy or logical positivism. And existentialist conceptions of consciousness can be said to be broader than those of phenomenology. Husserl's notions of pure consciousness and the reduction, for example, were thought to be solipsistic. But Heidegger's concept of Dasein as a being in the world relates consciousness to the world. Sartre's concept of consciousness was somewhat different to Heidegger's, and this in part led to Heidegger's rejection of Sartre's work. Sartre describes consciousness as being for itself in contrast to and in relation to physical being in itself. On this view, physicality has immutable existence which cannot be deformed, reduced or threatened. Yet a contingent and ephemeral consciousness seeks the permanent in itself of physicality. But this project is impossible. Hence Sartre describes mankind as a useless passion. But in my view, Sartre's relation between these modes of being depend upon the agent's acceptance of this view. And I think that the properties of physicality need not be regarded as inescapably desirable. That is, some things may be inescapably desirable, but not the permanence or objectivity of physicality. So the permanence of physicality can be replaced with a more appropriate sufficiency of value. Yet this is my own view that we need not explore further here. But Sartre's binary view of conscious being for itself and physical being in itself has been criticized as dualistic, and he is also sometimes criticized for traces of his seemingly Cartesian rationalism. Yet Sartre is a contradictory thinker as well as an interesting thinker to disagree with. And Sartre contrasts with Descartes, not only with his descriptions of human beings in the world, but also with his articulation of the existentialist mantra that existence precedes essence. That is, in contrast to the traditional idea of mankind having an essence or a fixed human nature, individuals come into the world and then make themselves through their own choices and actions. This brings us to freedom as perhaps the most important idea or principle in existentialist thought. And the idea of freedom brings us into different aspects of existentialist and other forms of thought, such as the idea that existentialists don't feel that they have to prove that we have free will. They hold that they know they have free will in feeling the anxieties of life and making choices. That is, it's experienced in conflict, moral choice, and the responsibilities of choosing. And they might want to say that it isn't possible not to believe in free will, or in its idealized form as freedom. This is because the absence of a belief in free will undermines our motivation. Without this belief, we wouldn't be able to act or move at all. Our motivations would freeze. As well as that predetermination would remove meaning from our thoughts and actions. For Robert Nozick, for instance, the absence of free will undercuts meaning in life. And freedom, as a prerequisite of meaning, has a basis in modern culture, existentialism, and ethics. But the indispensability of freedom to find meaning seems to be a cultural bias, and lack of freedom precludes meaning from people who don't have the required freedom. So freedom only seems to be a contingent criterion of meaning. But more strongly, free will is a precondition of morals and moral value, which can't be chosen without free choice. Yet this isn't the kind of existential choice that existentialists find so crucial. Existential choice isn't just a matter of rationally choosing the best option, like paying $5 instead of 10. Existential choice requires us to search deeply into our own inner resources to make an authentic choice. And such choice cannot simply draw upon our knowledge and reason. Sophie's Choice is an extreme example of existential choice. This is the story of the Nazis who asked Sophie which one of her daughters should die. If she fails to choose, they will kill both of them. Moreover, existential choice eschews cognition and reason for action as inviting inauthenticity. This is because strong reasons for action are thought to detract from the essential subjectivity of choice. For Kierkegaard, for example, choice is an instant of madness or leap of faith without sufficient reason. Yet for existentialists, there may not have been reasons for making that choice, not even authentically. But once the choice has been made, we are asked to take responsibility for it and claim it as our own. And in these discussions, Sartre is often taken as the primary representative of this existentialist view. We have just noted the ethical implications of freedom or free will, and these are problematic for existentialism. And we should also notice how Sartre's conception of consciousness has implications for these concepts. That is, his binary, ungraduated, and ultra-phenomenological view of consciousness as a plenum of existence. Firstly, Sartre has another binary or ungraduated conception of free will that seems to be extremely unrealistic. This is because some thinkers like Merleau-Ponty, Julian Bagani and myself believe in degrees of free will. Yet Sartre states that we are wholly and forever free or not free at all. I will just point this out and leave you to decide and not argue the case here. Another consequence of his binary perspective is his conception of responsibility, which is another existentialist tenet. Responsibility is an important concept in ethics, but Sartre maintains that we are responsible for everything, not just our own actions. We are responsible, for example, for events that happened in wars of the past. Yes, there is a sense in which we all collectively have a part to play in the events of the world, and as human beings we all share in the causes and reasons why things happen. But Sartre's claims of collective responsibility are extreme and unrealistic. Sartre similarly tells us that we are condemned to be free, and by implication we are condemned to choose, and that even not choosing is a kind of choice. This may be the case for ideally fully conscious state, but I have doubts about this in cases of indifference or sheer lack of awareness. Authenticity is another existentialist principle that seems to be very attractive, but the classic criticism of authenticity as an ethical principle is that of an act that authentically expresses one's values but is unethical, such as the perhaps authentic actions of Nazis. Yet Sartre has his own reason for emphasizing freedom, authentic choice and responsibility. And this can be explained by Sartre's spirit of seriousness that also illustrates existential choice. The spirit of seriousness takes subjective values as objective to avoid freedom and responsibility. The seriousness is to say that certain values are objective and therefore we have no choice. But Sartre regards this as inauthentic, bad faith, and hiding behind ideas of objectivity. These are some of the problems that make an existentialist ethics difficult to construct. Nietzsche, for example, was an avowed critic of conventional morals and religion to be replaced by aesthetics. Existentialism is also an individualistic perspective which doesn't lend itself to social theories. Yet it might be thought to able to offer an individual ethic of authenticity and freedom. But existentialism has even been criticized as an individualistic philosophy. Hubert Dreyfus, for example, criticizes how some existentialists freely assign meanings to things without restraint. He criticizes Nietzschean and Sartrean autonomy that seeks to impose itself on the world. And he singles out the author David Foster Wallace as imposing meaning upon life in acts of will and control. Dreyfus regards this as ultimately an unlivable, indiscriminate and obtuse response to life. Conversely, the meaning of events cannot be either accepted as simply given or chosen as acts of pure will. Events must be taken on board, yet reinterpreted and moulded to our own preferences. Three very significant factors which bear upon meaning are truth or fact, other people, and death. We can discuss an existentialist view of death shortly. The underlying problems of ethics, however, that existentialism exposes is that of values. Sartre rejects the ideas of fixed human nature or essence from which values could be derived. Values must therefore, it seems, be created with the kinds of problems that Dreyfus cites. Yet existentialism, and particularly Nietzsche, is the archetypal philosopher of created values. He writes, "Whatever has value in a world now does not have value in itself, but has been given value, and it was we who gave and bestowed it. Only we have created the value, the world that concerns man." Yet existentialists strongly maintain the values of freedom, authenticity, and responsibility as principles. Such normative values might be regarded as inconsistent with the idea of the freedom to create values. Freedom or free will is a precondition of moral values, but is inadequate itself as a value. Sartre claimed freedom as a moral value in protecting the freedom of other people. But freedom is much too specific to establish a moral principle. Yet existentialism has another, less discussed method of establishing values from the structures of consciousness. Heidegger, for example, cites care as the being of Dasein, and Sartre writes that the being of the self is value, and that reflective consciousness cannot rise without at the same time disclosing values. This concurs with the modern view of Hilary Putnam and others that knowledge is value laden. More explicitly, Sartre writes that every choice supposes elimination and selection that thereby produce value, and that choice isn't just a preference but a selection traced back to its ontological foundation. Sartre wants to trace selection to its ontological foundation, but he doesn't do this explicitly. But we can explain and extend the notions of choice and selection with the concept of contrast. Monotone is inimical to selection, choice, value, perception, and indeed to consciousness. These capacities need contrast like a black spot on a white board. We can then say that every perception entails contrast, selection, and value. We look one way and make a selection and preference that produces an antithesis or a negation. Selection entails preference and value. Elimination implies contrast as a precondition of value. These may be just nascent values, yet that is to be expected when explaining the origins of value. But these aren't the kind of substantive values that are required in motivation and moral imperatives. Yet Martin Heidegger and Edmund Husserl offer an account that does provide more substantive values. That is, Heidegger emphasized the structures of temporality and time as the horizon of being. Husserl spoke of the flow of consciousness and the flow of becoming, in which every experience has necessarily been preceded in time by experiences. That is, we find ourselves in a world of time or temporality, as well as diversity, divisibility, selection, and choice. The diversity of the world demands selections and choices that produce value. Yet consciousness is also moving through time as well as through diversity in space. And substantive values must be continually produced to cope with the flow of existence. An explanation of how such values could give normative guidance requires a value theory of ethics, argued elsewhere. But the point here is to show how existentialist structures of consciousness offers a basis for values. As to what those values might be, we have seen the general principles of freedom, authenticity, and responsibility. More specifically, Sartre writes about refraining from certain kinds of relations with objects. He writes that we should refrain from appropriating things for their own sake, and that we should try to realize the symbolic appropriation of being in itself. Unquote. We should bypass the idea of the symbolic appropriation of being itself, expressed here. This is because Sartre takes the view that, he says, many men, in fact, know that the goal of their pursuit is being. But the more relevant point here is the particular conception of relations with objects. This is because existential choice eschews cognition and reasons for action as inviting inauthenticity. This account provides a way into another moral view in the form of attenuated cognition that I argue elsewhere. That is, using unwarranted degrees of cognitive support that can be considered inauthentic and self-indulgent. An intuitively acceptable example is moral fortitude, which forgoes excessive social endorsement. Yet, surprisingly, we can make comparisons of such ideas with religion. One of these ideas is that of philosophy, and particularly existentialism as mythology. That is, philosophy need not be a vehicle of absolute truth, but as a process of developing ideas. Such is compatible with both descriptive philosophy and Robert Nozick's exploratory philosophy. An example of this can similarly be found in a comparison between Gnosticism and existentialism. And this can be seen in that existentialism is to analytic philosophy to what Gnosticism is to religion. That is, Gnosticism and existentialism unexpectedly share similar methods, values, and aspirations. For example, in Heidegger, Dasein is thrown into the world, which is a standard phrase in Gnostic writings. Nietzsche declares the death of God, yet the Gnostic God is also absent from the world. Both Gnosticism and existentialism emphasize alienation, anxiety, dread, and forlornness in the world. Gnostics seek the mystical experience of gnosis, existentialists seek the lived experience. And both Gnosticism and existentialism are engaging with the mystery of existence. Another comparison is found in the idea of independence from cognition or from cognitive thought, already made in the ideas of morals above. This is a preference for independence from cognition in religion, as well as in existentialism and religion. This is illustrated by Kierkegaard's leap of faith and religious view that God cannot be proven. And likewise, strong reasons for actions are thought to detract from the essential subjectivity of existential choice. That is, reasons for actions aren't abandoned, but regarded as impediments to quality of choice. Finer comparisons and contrasts can also be made between existentialist and religious attitudes to death. Religion can be rightly criticized for evading the issue of death by pushing it back into eternal life. But there is another religious attitude to death which overcomes death by embracing it. This is found in the idea of the solidarity with God, of God with mankind, who even dies with mankind. The idea is that God, who is the highest value, takes death unto himself, and death is thereby sanctified by its integration into the highest value. This is the attitude to death I want to compare with existentialism. Viktor Frankl, the author of From Death Camp to Existentialism, holds that death itself is what makes life meaningful. This is because death limits time, which gives it value and meaning. Unending time would be valueless. Robert Nozick criticizes this as only one kind of structural limitation, finiteness in time. And of itself, limitation doesn't produce value, it only amplifies it. Yet similarly, Heidegger sees death as a full stop, a completion, a culmination that can give meaning to life. Death is, I quote, a possibility of being which Dasein itself has to take over as an authentic choice. Death, in Heidegger's view, must be accepted in anxiety as an authentic choice. But Sartre's critique of Heidegger is that death is a contingent event, so it can't be essential to meaning. A criticism of Sartre is that a wider meaning of death as loss can give it a philosophical significance, and a wider significance of death can also be found as a metaphor for loss and human finitude. The above are some limitations of Frankl's, Heidegger's and Sartre's responses to death. So it's not clear in their accounts how the value of life and authenticity resolve the problem of death. Yet I agree with Sartre that there is a problem of reifying death, or giving it an absolute status. Heidegger's response to death, in his authentic being towards death, was challenged by Sartre. We noted that Sartre saw that death is just a contingent fact of life that cannot ground a philosophy of life. But death can also be conceived of as an absent future, and we can then ask, what kind of present can confront an absent future? Heidegger offers the idea of being towards death is grounded in care, and care is a particular kind of value state. It is an independence of value in the face of death that he describes as unsupported by concernful solicitude. It is a sufficiency of value in the present that can resist the menaces of death as an absent future. In conclusion, we can ask again, what can existentialism tell us about human existence as consciousness? We can first answer that existentialism tackles issues about life like death, and that other approaches like analytic philosophy and even phenomenology do not take on. And then human existence is given focus in the concept of consciousness, and we are able to understand these dimensions with ideas like Dasein, being for itself, existential choice, selection, authenticity and bad faith. Next week we'll discuss Buddhism as another approach to consciousness and human existence. So let me have your comments and criticisms at the meeting or on websites like Zoom or meetup.com.